He had everything, except the one thing that makes life worth living. Nathan Callahan was a powerful CEO who lived in a penthouse above the city, rich, respected, and completely alone. He controlled everything: meetings, people, even emotions. But one night, staring at his own reflection in the glass, he realized no one would be there if he disappeared. And Claire Jensen. She was the quiet secretary 11 floors below, widowed young, healing silently. She noticed everything about him: his silence, his anger, his loneliness, but she never said a word until the day he crossed a line that made her walk away. Now imagine this. You've hurt the only person who ever saw you clearly. You can't undo the past, but you're willing to become someone better, not for love, but because it's right. Would you wait? Would you change? This is not a story of instant redemption. It's about choosing kindness, one quiet step at a time. And sometimes, that's more powerful than love itself. If this story touches you, please like, share, and leave a comment below. We'd love to know, have you ever met someone who changed your life by simply being kind? Now, let's begin. He had everything: power, money, prestige. But when he looked in the mirror every night, there was no one waiting behind him, only silence. Nathan Callahan was the kind of man who never lost control. Not of his schedule, not of his words, not of his image. At 45, he was the founder and CEO of Callahan & Co., a powerhouse in the real estate market with gleaming buildings and high-end properties that bore his name across the Carolinas. He was the man other men in tailored suits whispered about over cocktails, the one investors trusted, competitors envied, and employees feared. Every morning began with the same ritual: black coffee, no cream. No sugar, served in the same chipped ceramic mug he'd owned for 2 decades. A 15-minute treadmill run, followed by a cold shower and a glance at the day's agenda, always arranged to the minute. By 7:00 a.m., he was in the elevator, ascending to the top floor of his office building in uptown Charlotte. He didn't like surprises. His office reflected the man himself: sleek, minimalist, and almost too quiet. A single photograph of the city skyline hung behind his desk. The rest of the room was clean lines, steel accents, and glass walls that kept everyone visible but distant. Nathan believed in structure, in results, in clean transitions and tighter deadlines. He didn't believe in birthday cards or team-building retreats or long lunches. Emotions, he often said, were distractions, and distractions led to failure. That mindset had made him wealthy, but it had also left him alone. He had been married once, nearly a decade ago. Her name was Emily, a soft-spoken art consultant who, for a brief time, brought color into his grayscale world. But like a painting in the wrong room, she faded against the backdrop of his ambition. One evening over dinner, she quietly told him, "You never let me in." And Nathan, without malice, replied, "I didn't think I had to." The divorce was civil, clean. They went their separate ways with no public drama, no shared children, no late-night regrets, at least none he ever admitted. He moved into a penthouse overlooking the city, where silence became a familiar presence, not an intruder. From the outside, it was a life anyone would envy: private elevator, Italian marble countertops, a wine cellar curated by professionals. But inside, it was a museum of stillness. No scuff marks on the floor, no fingerprints on the fridge, no sounds of another voice echoing down the hall. People often said he was composed, powerful, maybe even cold. But Nathan didn't mind. He didn't need their warmth. He had success, or so he told himself. That particular Tuesday, The sky had been gray all day. One of those late fall afternoons where the sun never quite makes it through the clouds. Meetings had stretched longer than planned. A potential merger was stalling. A junior executive had mishandled a deal. Nathan left the office just after 8 p.m. The building's cleaning crew was the only sign of life as he walked through the marble lobby, briefcase in hand, tie still perfectly knotted. His driver was already waiting at the curb, the car heated just to his preferred 72 degrees. The drive home took 12 minutes. Upstairs, the penthouse greeted him like always, soft lighting, automatic blinds half drawn, the faint hum of the air system. He set down his briefcase, loosened his tie, and walked to the kitchen. He wasn't hungry, but poured himself a small glass of Scotch Glenlivet 18. One of the few indulgences he allowed himself. No ice. He carried it to the living room and paused before the massive window that overlooked the glowing sprawl of Charlotte. The city looked alive, even at night. Cars crawled like fireflies. Billboards blinked. But from up here, it was all muted, distant, like a painting behind glass. Nathan took a sip. It tasted like habit. He set the glass down and walked to the turntable tucked in the corner, an old thing he rarely used but never gave away. Tonight, for no clear reason, he chose to play a record. Kinda Blue, by Miles Davis. As the needle dropped, the soft crackle gave way to slow, aching jazz. The music seeped into the room like something remembered too late. He moved to the window again and for a long time said nothing, just stood there. What did it matter, really? How many contracts were signed? How many zeros followed his net worth? At the end of the day, he still came home to the same silence. No footsteps in the hall, no coat hanging beside his, no second coffee mug in the dishwasher, not even a plant he had to water. He had built his empire with precision. But no amount of success had prepared him for this kind of emptiness, the kind that didn't come with instructions or a quarterly report. He caught sight of his reflection in the glass. Sharp features, perfect posture, crisp shirt. But the eyes staring back at him looked tired. Not from work, from living so long without softness. He didn't move for several minutes, letting the music play, letting the silence settle. The weight of the day, of all the days before it, pressing in around him like fog. Finally, he turned away, set the record player to stop after the final track, and turned off the lights. The room dimmed slowly, the skyline outside blinking like far-off stars. Nathan checked his tablet one last time before bed. Meetings, a conference call, budget approvals, and at the bottom of the list, a name, Claire Jensen, weekly status check, 9:15 a.m. He frowned slightly, then turned off the screen. Tomorrow would be another efficient day, with the same emptiness. She moved through the office like a shadow, always present, never noticed. Until now. Claire Jensen had long since mastered the art of staying invisible, not in a dramatic way. She didn't hide or shrink. She just stayed small, purposefully gentle in her steps, careful with her words, always 2 paces behind the noise. To most people at Callahan & Co., she was simply the quiet woman at the executive desk on floor 11. The one who always had her hair tied back, her notes ready, and the coffee brewed before anyone else arrived. The one who never missed a meeting, never raised her voice, and never lingered near the water cooler. But that quiet hid a life far richer than anyone imagined. Claire was 34, widowed at 30. A woman who had seen the kind of grief that leaves you hollow at the edges, not loud with pain, but worn down, like a stone smoothed by river water. She lived in Concord, just outside Charlotte, in a weathered craftsman-style home with a screened porch and a front yard full of hydrangeas. Her mother, recovering from a second heart surgery, lived with her, along with Claire's younger sister, who worked part-time at a bookstore. Every morning, Claire left before sunrise. She drove through the back roads with classical music on low, her coffee in a travel mug that had faded into pale blue. She liked the quiet hour before the city came alive, the in-between time, where she didn't have to explain who she was or why she still wore her wedding band on a chain around her neck. She'd been at Callahan & Co. for 5 years. Hired initially as a temporary admin, she quickly became indispensable. She didn't push for promotions, didn't brag about accomplishments, but Nathan Callahan noticed her efficiency, her ability to anticipate, her stillness. So she became his personal secretary. It wasn't an easy job. Nathan was a man of few words and high expectations. He didn't say thank you, didn't ask how her weekend went. He never complimented her handwriting, though she took care to make it neat in his briefings. Never mentioned how she always kept extra black pens in his drawer because he only liked that kind. Still, Claire stayed. Not because she couldn't find another job, but because she understood men like Nathan, men who were proud and silent, and maybe just a little broken in places they'd never admit. She didn't pity him. She didn't want to fix him. But she saw him. And some days, that felt like enough. She saw the way he watched the city more than the people in it. The way he skipped lunch but stared at his phone when no one was around. The way his shoulders stiffened slightly when someone laughed too loudly in the hallway. He wasn't cruel, just unreachable. Like a house with all the lights off, but a car parked in the driveway. Claire didn't knock. She simply left things at the door. Her kindness was subtle. A fresh pot of tea instead of coffee when he looked pale. Quiet reminders tucked into his calendar for the anniversary of his father's death. Always phrased professionally, of course, but thoughtful. And he never once said thank you. Still, she stayed, until that Tuesday. It had started like any other day, gray light through the high windows, the buzz of elevators, the muted rhythm of keyboards. Claire wore a soft gray blouse and a navy skirt. Her hair was braided to the side. She looked like herself put together, precise, almost forgettable. But her mind was not on the reports or the emails. Her mother had been coughing more than usual. Fatigue had returned. A routine checkup had turned into an urgent referral. And now, Claire needed to leave by 3:30 to drive her to the heart clinic. She approached Nathan's office at 2:55, knocked once, waited. "Come in," he said, eyes still on his screen. She stepped in quietly, folder in hand. "Mr. Callahan," she began gently. "I'd like to leave a bit early today. I've already rescheduled your 4:0 with Lambert and confirmed your notes for tomorrow's board call." He didn't look up. "Why?" he asked flatly. "My mother has a specialist appointment," Claire said. "I'd like to drive her." Nathan finally raised his eyes, not in concern, but with something closer to irritation. "You know how I feel about early departures," he said. Claire stood still. "It's been a tense quarter. Everyone's stretched thin. If personal matters take priority, maybe we need to rethink your role." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They landed with the weight of dismissal. Claire didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She only nodded once, and in that small motion, something long held within her shifted. "I understand," she said quietly. And then, for the first time in 5 years, she smiled not out of kindness, but clarity. A small, private smile, one that didn't ask permission. She left the folder on his desk, walked out without another word. She smiled faintly, walked out, and began to change in ways he never saw coming. You don't need to shout to be remembered. Sometimes, A cup of tea and a soft gesture can echo for weeks. The stomach pain began as a dull pressure easy to ignore. At first, Nathan had pushed through 2 12-hour days without proper meals, drinking coffee like water and forgetting, as usual, that the body had limits. Stress was nothing new. But that morning, something clenched deep beneath his ribs, sharp enough to make him pause mid-sentence during a meeting. He didn't say anything. Of course, he never did. The boardroom emptied, the air thick with polished silence, and Nathan sat alone with his hand pressed low against his suit jacket. He waited until the discomfort dulled, then returned to his office as if nothing had happened. Later that afternoon, his assistant, his former assistant, as she now technically was, appeared in the doorway for what he thought might be the final time. Claire had taken her leave quietly after their exchange the week before. She hadn't returned his clipped email asking her to reconsider. She hadn't protested or pleaded, hadn't even blinked when he'd implied her loyalty was questionable. She'd simply stepped away. But now she stood there again, in that same soft gray blouse, holding a steaming mug and a folded piece of paper. No expression on her face, no confrontation. "I'll leave this here," she said gently, placing the cup on the edge of his desk. Before he could reply, she turned and walked out, silent as ever. Nathan blinked at the cup. It wasn't coffee. The aroma told him it was something herbal ginger, maybe with a trace of honey. The scent wrapped around him like warmth from another time, though he couldn't remember when. He picked up the note. The handwriting was neat, unmistakably hers. "Don't skip meals. It's not heroism." That was it. 7 words, no signature, but they landed like a stone in still water. Nathan stared at the paper for longer than he cared to admit. His first reaction was confusion. Then, strangely, something that felt like shame. Not because she was right though she was, but because she'd noticed, and worse, because she still cared enough to do something about it. Most people, after a dismissal like that, would have vanished without looking back. But Claire had left tea. That night, Nathan didn't go straight home. He stayed late in the office, pacing, not working, not planning, just thinking. He sat in the chair across from his own desk, the one Claire had once occupied, usually with a quiet hum of efficiency and a half-finished to-do list in hand. The air felt different there, quieter, but not in the sterile way he was used to. There was a subtle peace to it, a steadiness. He glanced around and saw little traces he'd missed before. A small potted succulent tucked beside the printer. A jar of smooth river stones, probably a grounding tool, though he'd never asked. A pen holder labeled with a quote from Jane Austen. How long had those been there? How many things had she touched in this office, gently and without fanfare, making his days easier while he treated her like just another item in his calendar? The next morning, something strange happened. Nathan found himself listening for the sound of footsteps. A soft knock. The rustle of paper as someone placed his schedule on the desk. The light scrape of a chair being pushed in with care. But none of it came. Claire didn't return. And yet, her presence lingered like a scent that wouldn't leave the air. He began to notice things he hadn't before. The scent of lavender and lemon, her subtle perfume, still clung faintly to the hallway outside his door. The mail cart was now slower, noisier without her pushing it. The new temp secretary, competent but rushed, always left his schedule slightly crooked on the desk. And when someone else poured his coffee, it was too hot. She had been the quiet rhythm that held his world together, and he had never said thank you. Days passed, then a week, and with each passing hour, Nathan found himself noticing more. The way she always paused to greet the janitor by name. The way her voice softened when speaking to vendors on the phone. The way her desk remained unnaturally organized, even in her absence, like it was waiting for her return. She had never asked for attention, never demanded praise. But now, her absence spoke louder than anything she'd ever said. Nathan, a man who built towers from blueprints and bent cities to his will, found himself powerless against the memory of a woman who had never tried to impress him. She simply had. One morning, as he stirred sugar into tea, her tea still sitting on the break room shelf, he caught his reflection in the microwave door. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain. He set the spoon down and returned to his office, but he didn't open his emails. Instead, he looked at the space she once filled. And he waited, not for results, not for meetings, for her. He didn't say it aloud, but something inside him had begun to shift. The silence she left behind was louder than anything he'd heard in years. He began noticing, and that was the beginning of the unraveling. It started with her leaving early every Thursday, and with him watching the elevator door a little too long. Nathan never noticed the patterns of other people. He built his life to be immune to them habits, small talk, moods that changed with the weather. They were things for softer people, people who had time to look around. But lately, without quite meaning to, he'd begun to notice Claire. It wasn't a conscious decision, just an awareness. A subtle awareness that her chair stayed empty after 3:30 every Thursday, that her computer screen was dark by the time he returned from late meetings, that she walked a little faster on those days, glancing at the clock more than usual. At first, he brushed it off. A family errand, perhaps, a recurring appointment. But something about the regularity made him curious. And once curiosity slipped into his routine, it lingered like a thread he couldn't untangle. The following Thursday, as he walked to his car earlier than usual, Nathan caught a glimpse of her near the side entrance of the building. She was wearing a light blue coat he hadn't seen before, holding her phone loosely in one hand. Her steps were lighter than normal. She didn't see him. She crossed the street, rounded the corner, and disappeared into the late afternoon hum of Charlotte. He shouldn't have followed, but he did. It wasn't deliberate. That's what he told himself. He took the long way back toward the parking structure, down Trade Street where old brick buildings met sleek storefronts. The city was alive in a way his penthouse never was, people moving in pairs, laughter spilling out of cafes, and that's when he saw her. Through the frosted window of Maple and Main, an old cafe tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop. Claire was sitting at a small table near the window, hands wrapped around a steaming mug. Across from her sat a man mid-40s, kind eyes, corduroy blazer with a bit of wear at the elbows. He leaned in when he spoke, and Claire laughed. Not politely, not professionally. A real laugh, soft and wide, the kind that made her eyes shine. Nathan stopped walking. It was strange, the feeling that rose in him, not anger, not even surprise. It was more like a vacancy, something hollow cracking open inside his chest, a place that had been empty for so long, he hadn't realized how fragile it was. He turned away before they could see him, walked quickly, hands shoved in his coat pockets, the hum of the city suddenly far too loud. The next morning, Claire arrived early, as she always did, but there was a new detail he couldn't ignore: a single sprig of lavender tucked into the pocket of her bag. Her blouse was pale pink. She wore a subtle shade of lipstick, nothing flashy, nothing out of place. But she looked different, not in how she dressed, in how she carried herself. Her steps had more lift, her shoulders more ease. She smiled as she greeted the receptionist and paused to ask the intern if she needed help finding a document. Small things. Things she might have done before. But now Nathan noticed every one of them. He found himself watching more than working that morning, listening, not to meetings, but to the soft sound of her humming near the copier. Even her typing had a rhythm. Then he saw it, her planner open on her desk, handwritten notes in delicate cursive. Thursdays, 4 Warjero, Eli, Maple and Maine. His chest tightened. He didn't recognize the emotion at first. It had been years since he let anything close to jealousy inside his well-fortified walls. But there it was gnawing, uninvited. Eli. Even the name sounded like someone from a novel. Nathan pictured him again, the blazer, the warmth, the way he leaned in when Claire laughed. That laugh. The one Nathan had never earned. Claire hadn't said a word about the man. She didn't owe him that. She wasn't his assistant anymore. She wasn't anything to him, really. Except she had been. For 5 years. She had been constant, silent, supportive. And now, she was something else. She brought a small bouquet to her desk the next morning. Yellow daisies and tiny wildflowers in a glass jar. A quiet rebellion against the gray office walls. Nathan stared at them longer than he should have. He tried to shake the feeling, tried to bury it in spreadsheets and legal briefs. But the unease remained. She was changing, not loudly, not dramatically, just blooming, and she hadn't changed for him. That realization stung more than he expected. She was blooming, and it wasn't because of him. He never planned for love. He planned everything else. But love isn't something you can pencil in between board meetings. Nathan Callahan didn't do messy. He thrived on control, on order, timetables, measurable outcomes. He had crafted a world so predictable that even silence came on schedule. But now, nothing made sense. In the days following his accidental discovery of Claire's Thursday meetings with Eli, Nathan found himself unraveling in ways both unfamiliar and uncomfortable. And instead of naming the emotion, he fought it. He told himself it was about loyalty, about professionalism, about the strange feeling of disruption in his otherwise smooth operating world. But the truth, unspoken and heavy, was this: he missed her. And not just the way she managed his calendar or arranged his files. He missed the way she paused before closing the door, just in case he had one more thing to add. He missed the quiet steadiness she brought into his chaos. He missed her kindness, not loud, not showy, but felt. And the more he missed, the more irritable he became. He started questioning things that had never bothered him before. Why is the conference room always overbooked? Who ordered these pens? Why is the lobby music so loud? His staff exchanged glances behind his back. The tension in the office rose, slow and heavy, like humidity before a storm. Claire noticed. Of course, she noticed everything, but she didn't confront it. Instead, she continued on with the same quiet grace she'd always carried. Her smile remained gentle, her voice steady. She handled his outbursts with the same calm as always, unflinching, unwavering. And that made it worse, because part of him wanted her to react, to push back, to ask him what was wrong, to care enough to make it messy. But Claire didn't. Not because she didn't care, but because she understood something Nathan had never learned. Some storms pass, and not all of them deserve a name. One Tuesday afternoon, after yet another unnecessarily sharp comment during a strategy meeting, Nathan sat alone in his office, staring at the hallway she had just walked down. He didn't know what he was waiting for. An apology from her. Or maybe from himself. That evening, against every line of his better judgment, Nathan did something he never thought he'd do. He made a request to IT. It was subtle. Framed as a security audit, a check on employee scheduling tools, nothing alarming. Nothing that would raise suspicion except to himself. He asked for access to Claire's shared calendar. The request came back quietly, without fanfare. He opened the file, and there it was, week after week, neatly noted in her own hand. Maple and Maine, 4:00, Eli. Bookstore event, 6:30, Eli reading. Sunday brunch, Eli's mom. The names and times blurred into one sharp realization. She was building a life. Without him. Nathan stared at the screen, a cold knot forming in his chest. He wasn't angry at Claire. She had every right to move forward, to find companionship, to laugh at cafe tables and wear new perfume and bring fresh flowers into her day. What shook him was the realization that she'd been right there, day after day, and he'd never seen her. Not really. He had built walls so high, she had to whisper just to be heard. And now that someone else listened, she had no reason to stay. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, the damage was already done. Claire entered his office with a soft knock. She placed a folder on his desk, then stood quietly, hands folded in front of her. "I know," she said. Nathan looked up, startled. "About the calendar," she added. "It flagged it for me. Said it was an unusual access request." He said nothing. Claire nodded once, the sadness in her eyes deeper than anger could ever reach. "I've submitted my resignation," she said, 2 weeks' notice, "but I'll transition everything cleanly." Nathan opened his mouth, but no words came. She continued, gently but firmly. "This isn't about the job. I've worked under pressure before, but I don't feel safe here. Not emotionally, not ethically." Her voice didn't shake. Nathan felt the weight of her words press against every corner of the room. Not safe. It echoed like a truth too long buried. "I never meant to," he began, but she stopped him with a small shake of her head. "It's not about what you meant," she said softly. "It's about what you chose to ignore." And with that, she walked out, not in anger, not in haste, just finished. Nathan sat in silence long after she left. The city buzzed below. Emails pinged on his screen. The world moved on. But in his office, something hollowed out. For the first time in years, Nathan realized he had lost something that mattered not in a business deal or a contract negotiation, but in something far more fragile. Something he hadn't known he was allowed to want. He had lost her without ever having her. Some heartbreaks don't scream. They sit in the silence, rearranging who you thought you were. Nathan Callahan had never been good with silence. Not the kind that came after a long meeting or between elevator chimes. Those he could handle. But this was different. This silence followed him home. It curled in the corners of his penthouse. It waited in the steam rising from his untouched coffee. It hummed in the space where Claire's presence used to be, not loud, not obvious, just missing. And for the first time, Nathan stopped pretending it didn't matter. He missed 2 board meetings that week. One, he simply forgot. The other, he sat through without hearing a word. His assistant knew, polished, and painfully efficient, kept asking if everything was all right. He nodded. Of course, he always did, but the numbers on his spreadsheets no longer made sense. The forecasts felt hollow. He'd built empires with these hands, and now they trembled when he poured tea. He didn't know what to do with the ache inside him. So, for once, he didn't try to solve it. Instead, he did something completely out of character. He called a therapist. The number came from a card Claire had once left behind by accident, tucked in a notebook she'd lent him during a presentation. He remembered the name, the way it had been underlined twice. And so, on a rainy Tuesday morning, Nathan found himself sitting in a small, sunlit office with warm-toned walls and soft chairs that didn't match. The therapist's name was Dr. Eliza Warren, middle-aged, calm-eyed, patient in the way people are when they've heard more pain than judgment. At first, he didn't speak much. He talked about the company, about productivity, about pressure. But then one session bled into the next, and he spoke of Emily, his ex-wife, who had once tried to build a home inside his fortress. She wanted warmth. He said quietly, "I gave her windows." Then, for the first time in over a decade, he mentioned something even he had buried too deep. Their son. His name had been Ben. He had lived only 6 weeks. Nathan hadn't held him for long, hadn't known how to. The grief had been too large, too raw, and he'd responded the only way he knew how, by shutting every door. "I told myself it was better not to feel anything at all," Nathan whispered, "and I got good at that. Too good." Dr. Warren didn't interrupt. Over the weeks, she taught him small things, how to breathe, not just efficiently, but gently, how to write not emails, but letters, by hand, letters he'd never send but needed to write, how to listen not for answers, but for truth. At night, he began walking. He didn't know why exactly, but he'd find himself driving to Concord, parking quietly near the edge of Claire's old neighborhood. The street lamps were softer there, the sidewalks lined with dogwood trees and porches that smelled like jasmine. He never approached the house. He just walked. Sometimes past the bookstore she'd mentioned once, past the cafe she liked, past the little public garden where someone had planted herbs beside the benches. He imagined her laughing there, reading, holding hands with Eli. Maybe it hurt, but it was a clean kind of pain, like muscle rebuilding after a break. He wrote letters, too, some addressed to Claire, some to Emily, some to Ben. He never sent them, but they filled pages. "I didn't know how to love without control," he wrote once, "and now I'm learning how to release what I tried too hard to hold." He learned to notice things, the way sun pooled through the blinds at dawn, the hush before rain, the shape of regret not jagged but soft, worn from carrying it too long. He started saying thank you, to the barista, to the janitor, to his new assistant, when she remembered to bring tea. He even said it aloud, once, into the empty air of his office. "Thank you, Claire." Just that. Not because she could hear it, but because he needed to. He still didn't know what would come next. He didn't expect redemption, didn't expect her to return. But he was beginning to understand that healing didn't require certainty, only honesty and time. He was learning to become someone who could be forgiven. He didn't expect to see her again. But sometimes, life places the people you hurt in the places that test who you've become. It was a quiet Thursday in February, gray skies, soft drizzle, the kind of afternoon when the world seemed to move just a little slower. Nathan had wandered into the public library on East Boulevard without a plan. That was new for him, walking into places without purpose. But he'd begun to find peace in the in-between spaces, libraries, parks, grocery store aisles he didn't need to visit. He moved through the building with his hands in his coat pockets, nodding at a few people, breathing in the warm scent of old books and paper. It reminded him of something distant, something human. He wasn't looking for her, but there she was, through a wide glass window that separated the children's reading room from the main floor. Claire. She sat on a round rug, legs folded beneath her, a picture book open in her hands. Around her, a half circle of children leaned in, eyes wide, completely enchanted. She was wearing a pale blue dress and simple flats. Her hair was pulled back into a soft bun, and her face, God, her face held a light Nathan had never seen. She looked whole, alive in a way she never had behind the glass walls of his office. She turned a page and animated the voices, gentle, warm, never dramatic. The children giggled. One leaned closer and rested his chin on her knee, and Claire laughed, not politely, not shyly. It was the kind of laugh that fills a room without permission. Nathan froze. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood behind the bookshelf, watching a version of her he had never truly known. A version that had always existed but never bloomed under the weight of his indifference. He could have walked away. He should have. But instead, he reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue, a tarnished keychain shaped like a maple leaf. She'd dropped it months ago near the copier. He had meant to return it, but then everything happened. He had kept it in his drawer, buried beneath pens and clipped reports, as if waiting for the right moment, a moment that never came. Until now. Nathan stepped to the front desk and asked for an envelope. He wrote only her name on the front. Inside, he placed the keychain and a letter, written carefully, slowly, over the course of 3 weeks. Every word weighed, not for effect, but for truth. It read, Claire, I don't expect a response. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope you know this. I see you now. I see what I failed to value not just in the office, but in who you are. You gave without asking. You noticed without needing to be noticed. And I treated that as convenience, when it was actually grace. I've been learning, late, but learning. To sit with discomfort, to speak without defense, to recognize what I damaged because I refused to feel. This isn't a request. It's a recognition. Thank you for the tea. Thank you for the silence. Thank you for being the person I didn't know I needed to become better. You once reminded me not skipping meals isn't heroism. I'm beginning to understand what real strength looks like. I hope life is gentler to you than I was. And I hope you continue blooming wherever your roots find home. Nathan. He sealed the envelope, handed it to the librarian at the front desk, and asked her to pass it to the woman reading in the children's room after the session ended. Then he left. He didn't linger near the window, didn't wait outside. He walked into the drizzle, letting it soak into the collar of his coat. Heart steady, not light, but clearer. He didn't expect a reply. That wasn't the point. It wasn't about closure. It was about honesty, about finally showing up, even if no one was watching. The next day passed in silence, and the next, no email, no phone call, no sudden knock on his office door. But Nathan didn't spiral, because this time, it wasn't about outcome. It was about becoming someone worthy of trust, of grace, of the kind of woman who reads to children on rainy Thursdays and laughs with her whole being. He didn't ask for a reply, just a chance to be better. Forgiveness doesn't always arrive as words. Sometimes, it's an invitation, written in hope. It arrived in a plain envelope, tucked among business correspondence and quarterly reports so unassuming Nathan almost missed it. The handwriting was familiar, clean, curved, deliberate. He stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Inside, a simple cream-colored card, embossed in soft gold Charlotte Children's Literacy Fund, annual book drive and community reading night, hosted by Claire Jensen. The event was in 3 days, a Saturday evening, at the same library where he had last seen her, sunlight framing her like a memory too vivid to be real. There was no note, no explanation. Just his name, printed neatly on the invite list, like he belonged there. He didn't know what to make of it, but he kept the card on his desk for the next 3 days, glancing at it between meetings, tracing the edges with his thumb. He didn't tell anyone, didn't RSVP. But on Saturday evening, he put on a navy suit, not the sharpest one, not the one he wore to boardrooms, but the one Emily had once picked because it made him look like a man who listens. He arrived early, parked in the back, walked in quietly. The library looked different at night, warmer. Strings of lights hung along the archways. Children's drawings were taped along the walls. Tables filled with donated books. Laughter bubbled in the distance. Nathan didn't move past the lobby. He stood near the edge of the crowd, half hidden behind a display of local authors. He didn't know why he came, not exactly. Perhaps to honor the gesture. Perhaps just to see her again without breaking anything. And then he saw her. Claire. She stood beneath a paper banner painted by school children, her hair down this time, soft curls brushing her shoulders. She wore a deep green dress, simple and elegant, not trying to stand out, just belonging in a space she helped build. She greeted each guest with a light touch on the elbow or a warm smile. Her laugh still came easily, and her eyes carried that brightness that no longer made his chest ache, but instead softened something in him. Nathan stayed where he was. Watched. He didn't want to disrupt, didn't want to impose. He just wanted to witness. The evening unfolded gently readings, music, a small auction. Claire moved gracefully among the guests, a quiet anchor to the night's warmth. And then, as things wound down and people began gathering coats and children's drawings, she looked up and saw him. Their eyes met across the room. He didn't move. She paused just for a second, then said something softly to the volunteer next to her and made her way toward him. Her steps were calm, certain, not hesitant, not rushed. Nathan straightened his posture, hands folded in front of him, not defensive, just present. "Hi," she said softly when she reached him. "Hi," he replied, voice low. They stood for a moment in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. "Thank you for coming," she said. He nodded. "Thank you for inviting me." Claire tilted her head slightly, studying him not with judgment, but with quiet discernment, like someone who had learned how to see beyond what people said. Nathan swallowed. "I didn't come here expecting anything," he began. I wanted to honor the fact that you included me." She didn't respond immediately, so he continued. "I know I don't deserve a place in your life," he said. "Not after how I made you feel. I've been working on myself, not to win anything back, but because the version of me you knew isn't the one I want to leave behind." He let out a quiet breath. "I'm not asking for a second chance," he added. "At least, not in the way most people mean. If there's room, someday, for someone who listens better, who supports, not overshadows, I'd like to stand there." Claire looked down, fingers brushing the edge of the program she still held in her hand. Then she looked back up and smiled, soft, small, but real. She didn't step forward, but she didn't step away. "I appreciate that," she said, and for Nathan, those 3 words held more grace than any forgiveness ever spoken. They talked a little longer about the book drive, about the children's stories, about how cold the February nights had become. Nothing heavy, nothing deep, but everything real. When she excused herself to help close the silent auction table, she touched his arm gently, just a brush of her fingertips, like a memory made solid. He didn't follow. He just stood there, and exhaled. Claire didn't say yes, but she didn't walk away either. Sometimes, healing isn't a grand gesture. It's a quiet walk, a warm cup, a moment with no past between you. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic reunion, just a quiet Saturday morning, and 2 cups of coffee cooling between them. Claire had suggested a cafe tucked away in a corner of Dilworth, with ivy-covered brick and mismatched chairs, the kind of place that didn't care for speed. Nathan arrived 5 minutes early and waited with his hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, nervous in a way he hadn't felt in decades. And then she walked in. No makeup, her hair loose, a paperback tucked under her arm. She smiled, gently. He stood, unsure if he should hug her, shake her hand, or just offer her a seat. She solved it with a nod. Let's sit. That was how it began. No declarations, no apologies retold. Just a conversation over coffee about a book she'd just finished, and then another the following week, and another. They never set a schedule. There were no expectations. Sometimes they walked through the park near the library, talking about nothing in particular, how spring seemed to be arriving earlier this year, how children's books had gotten more poetic, how good silence felt when shared with someone who didn't try to fill it. Nathan learned to listen, not to reply, not to impress, but to witness. It was a kind of intimacy he had never understood before. Claire brought him books she thought he might like. Some fiction, some philosophy, a memoir about a man who found joy after losing everything. Nathan read them all slowly, with a yellow pencil in hand. He underlined words that hurt in beautiful ways. One afternoon, she handed him a thin novel by a Japanese author. "This one doesn't end the way you want it to," she warned, "but it ends the way it should." Nathan smiled. Sounds familiar. In late March, he signed up as a volunteer at the library. It surprised everyone, especially himself. He shelved books, organized donation bins, and once awkwardly read a picture book aloud to a group of toddlers who were more interested in the illustrations than his voice. Claire watched from a distance that day, arms folded, a quiet grin playing on her lips. Afterwards, she simply said, "You didn't sound half bad." He found that praise mattered more than any boardroom applause. One breezy afternoon, they sat on a bench beneath a blooming dogwood tree. Claire held a thermos of chamomile tea and stared at the sky for a long time before speaking. "I don't talk about him often," she said. Nathan didn't press. He waited. "My husband's name was David," she continued. "He taught middle school English, loved Keats, died in a car accident on his way to a student poetry recital." Nathan looked at her hand steady. "Still, I used to think I'd never laugh again," she said. "Never want again. And then I got used to quiet, to small routines. I wasn't sad, just settled." He stayed silent. Claire turned to him. "You scared me, Nathan. Not because you were cruel, but because you were unreachable. And I didn't want to lose myself trying to reach someone who didn't want to be found." Nathan nodded, words caught in his throat. Then, gently, he reached for her hand resting between them on the bench. He didn't squeeze, didn't hold on too long. Just a simple gesture, a quiet presence. She didn't pull away. From that day on, their rhythm became something sacred. Soft mornings with scones and shared pages, evenings at local author talks, a once-in-a-while walk by the lakeside without saying a word. They didn't define it, didn't name what was happening, because healing, for them, wasn't about rewriting the past. It was about choosing each day kindness over pride, presence over pretense. Nathan never asked where things were going, and Claire never demanded what he could not promise. One morning in April, as they sat outside the cafe, watching the world slowly turn green again, Claire stirred cream into her coffee and looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then she said, simply, "You're not the same man anymore." Nathan looked down, letting the words sink in not as a reward, but as a reflection, a confirmation that sometimes the slowest journeys are the most honest ones. He once thought power was everything. Now, he realized, kindness was harder, but worth it. 6 months had passed. The world hadn't shifted on its axis. The city still hummed, contracts were still signed, and buildings still rose into the skyline. But Nathan Callahan had changed, not in the way people usually notice, not with dramatic gestures or sudden declarations. No, his changes were quieter, gentler, like a season turning. His office no longer felt like a showroom. A small fern sat on the windowsill, thriving despite his poor track record with plants. A birthday calendar now hung beside his bookshelf, marked with names and tiny smiley-face stickers, added by his assistant's daughter when she visited one Friday afternoon. He still ran Callahan & Co., still made decisions with precision. But now, he paused more often, listened longer, remembered to ask, "How are you?" and meant it. When Claire's name came up in conversation, as it sometimes did from mutual acquaintances, he would smile without explaining, because the story didn't need explaining anymore. She had her own rhythm now. Claire was leading the Community Engagement Division at the Charlotte Public Library, a newly formed role funded in part by a grant Nathan had quietly helped secure without attaching his name. She hosted literacy programs, organized neighborhood reading nights, mentored teens interested in storytelling. She was, in every way, the center of something meaningful, and she looked happier than ever. They still met, of course, still exchanged books, still walked, still paused at cafes where silence was allowed to stretch between them without weight. But things had shifted. There was no longer fear, no tiptoeing, just space. And into that space, something honest was growing. One soft afternoon in late spring, they stood side by side at the edge of Freedom Park Lake. The cherry blossoms had shed most of their petals, but a few still danced in the breeze, landing like whispers on the water. Claire wore a simple cardigan and jeans. Her hair was pinned back loosely, and a paperback peeked from her tote bag. Nathan had brought tea in a thermos, 2 cups this time, one with honey, one without. They sipped quietly, watching 2 children race paper boats along the stone edge. After a while, Claire turned to him. Her voice was steady, but her eyes shimmered with something fragile and true. "I'm ready," she said. Nathan looked at her, heart pausing. "Not because I forgot," she continued, "but because you made it safe to try again." The air around them seemed to still. Nathan set down his cup, took a slow step closer, not with urgency, not with assumption, but with care. He reached for her hand, gently, giving her every second to pull away. She didn't. "I love you," he said softly. "And I promise to keep choosing you gently every day, not to fix the past, not to erase anything, but to build something real, something that listens." Claire didn't speak right away. Instead, she smiled, the kind of smile that holds years inside it, grief, healing, hope. Then she leaned her head lightly against his shoulder, and that was answer enough. That night, Nathan returned to his apartment. The same skyline stretched beyond his windows. The same furniture sat where it always had. But now there was warmth. The fern glowed in the lamp's golden light. A dog-eared book sat beside a second teacup. and a letter rested on his desk, one he had written to Ben long ago, but never thrown away. He didn't need to, because this wasn't about erasing chapters, it was about turning pages with intention. Claire never moved in. They didn't rush toward rings or announcements. They simply lived in each other's presence with trust and steady joy. The past didn't disappear. David remained a part of her story. Emily and Ben, a part of his. But those names weren't weights anymore. They were threads woven quietly into the fabric of who they were becoming. Together. And so, in a city that never stopped moving, two people who once mistook silence for safety, power for protection, and distance for dignity, found something softer. Not a fairy tale, but something even better. A real story. A new beginning. We often believe that success means control, power, and being unshakable. But life, in its quietest moments, teaches us that the deepest strength comes not from control, but from compassion. This story reminds us that it's never too late to change, not to impress, not to earn forgiveness, but to become someone better, simply because it matters. Sometimes the people we hurt are the very ones who showed us the mirror. And healing doesn't begin with grand apologies. It begins with humility, consistency, and kindness. For those of us who've lived long enough to carry regrets, this is a gentle reminder: growth doesn't always come in youth. It often finds us later, when we finally have the courage to listen to others and to ourselves. Love may not always return in the way we expect, but peace. Peace comes when we know we've done the quiet, hard work of becoming someone we ourselves can respect. So, wherever you are in your story, be kind, be real. And if there's someone you've wronged, let your next step be softer than your last. Thank you for spending this quiet moment with us. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories of healing, kindness, and second chances to life. We're so grateful to have you here. See you in the next story.